So this talk is called Flourishing in an Extremely Unequal World. I have a previous talk called Living in an Extremely Unequal World. You can find that on YouTube and on my Twitter, but I thought today I'd be a little bit more ambitious and try to think about what an extremely good future would look like. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what I mean by good in the context of post-AGI civilizations. I'm going to move on to this concept that I call the generalized alignment capabilities trade-off. And then lastly, I'm going to finish with an idea that I think is, I found very useful for thinking about far futures, namely the healthy asymmetric relationships. So just to give it like a very broad sketch of like some of the things that I'm thinking about when I'm talking about post-AGI civilizations, I think for a lot of people in this room, the most salient thing would be directly cures for aging and other diseases. I think I'm thinking about transhumanist tools that would take our abilities further, so things like brain-computer interfaces, genetic engineering, and so on. Eventually getting to the point of mind uploads and emulations. And then looking out on a further time frame, thinking about the automation of space colonization and human civilization expanding to very distant frontiers. And the sort of the core theme here, linking all of these, is that what we think of as our civilization or the descendants of our civilization will get significantly larger in scale, that it'll be in terms of population, there will be many digital minds, in terms of the amount of resources gathered, in terms of the productive capacity, the world will get much bigger if the future goes well. And given this, I think one aspect of that is typically underrated is that the world will likely also get far more diverse. So this is one of my favorite illustrations of the tree of life, starting from the origins of life on Earth and then expanding to a very large number of different species, some of which are alive today, many of which aren't. I think of this as a metaphor for the far future. And I think if there's one slide that I want you to be visualizing as we go through this talk, it's this slide here, that like, if we started off from single-celled organisms, and then it's extremely difficult to imagine the scope of new entities and new creatures that would arise over the next few hundreds of millions of years. But if we think similarly about the scope for new sentient minds and new general intelligences to emerge, I think there's an equal array of very strange and very hard to imagine possibilities. So a few analogies between this and the sort of future of human civilization or post-human civilization. One is that, of course, there's a very wide range of diversity. There's also extreme inequality in this diagram, and I think in the future that we're going to see, right? So here on this diagram, we have these different clades of animals and bacteria and plants and so on that are like taking up a very wide range of niches in an ecosystem. And most of them have like living ancestors, but like some whole clades have gone extinct. So there's this like inherently historical element to how this whole process has evolved, right? So if we're thinking about the future from this perspective, we're thinking about humanity speciating out, it starts to get a little trickier to ask the question, like, what would it mean for this process to go well, right? If we're thinking about like for a single species, for example, we might be able to talk about, what looks good for humanity, or what counts as flourishing for an individual human. But if we're thinking about a much wider and more diverse range of minds, it's much harder to say concretely, what does it mean for this whole ecosystem to be a good ecosystem? And I often find myself torn between two perspectives on this. The first perspective is the sort of, you could call it the view from nowhere, or a term popularized by Robin, who's here, the far mode thinking about the future. And when we're in the far mode of thinking about the future as this very distant entity, it's very, very easy to try and apply a single criterion to it, to say that there's some sort of like objective metric of what counts as a good future, and that a good future is just one which meets that standard, whatever that standard happens to be. Maybe it's like, you have a lot of consciousness in it, maybe you have a lot of happy lives and so on. But a second perspective that you can have is the view from here, or the near mode, the idea that like we exist right now, we and the other humans and the other sentient creatures, we have interests. We want to see those interests perpetuated. And so another way of thinking about the good future that's sort of diametrically opposed to this is just to say, well, a good future is one in which the people who are alive today are empowered to have children and to create dynasties that last in roughly the way that we would have wanted. And I think these two are quite opposed, right? Because if you actually take the criterion of moral good or a single objective seriously, then I think you end up in very anti-human places. To sort of paraphrase Yudkowsky, humans are made of atoms which you can use to create more moral goodness in the long term. And there's, if you have any particular standard for what you think of as good. Maybe it's consciousness, maybe it's happiness, maybe it's the ability to be creative or to like enjoy art or so on. Then humans just not going to be very good. And even human descendants or like any of our descendants that we give rise to are probably not going to be optimal for fulfilling that criterion, right? So there is a pretty strong trade-off between having some sense of a top-down goal for the future and then having this bottom-up perspective of people exist, they should have freedom and autonomy to continue pursuing their goals, many of which are process-oriented goals, right? So the goal of the value of autonomy or the value of democracy or property rights, they're not about how the future ends up, they're fundamentally about how we get to the future. So this is the trade-off that I'm trying to straddle here when we think about the future. Because on one hand, it's very suspicious to say, well, we want to optimize for a good future, and maybe that means that we end up losing out. Like all the people who are currently here and all the people who currently live in the world sort of end up losing out. That feels very suspicious. But at the same time, it feels very parochial to say that humans should be in charge indefinitely. That we should be able to maintain our grasp on resources just because we got here first. So there's these two conflicting intuitions that I'm going to try and balance in the rest of this talk. But I think there's a sense in which this trade-off is not just one that we face right now, it's a more fundamental trade-off. So what I'm calling the generalized alignment capabilities trade-off is the idea that you have to choose between having less control over your descendants, having them be more flexible, more autonomous, more powerful, more able to come up with new ideas, but then potentially facing the cost that they will end up changing their values or ending up pursuing values that you didn't like. And I think throughout human history, we've seen this process carry out as generations give rise to generations, and different, each generation is trying to ensure that they raise their children with their own values. We're seeing this now with humans trying to give rise to AIs that share their values, and we're also going to see this process continuing with AIs that are trying to create their own successors that are more capable than them, but also share the same values. And so when you face this trade-off is worse when there's more competitive pressure, right? So if everyone around you is racing to try and capture resources, then you're probably more willing to just take a punt and create very powerful descendants that you don't know if they're going to share your values. And that was, in some sense, what Joe's talk was about. But even if there's even if there are zero competitive pressures, even if you have all the time in the world to try and get it right, there's still this open question of like, well, how do we want to balance those trade-offs, right? Do we want, to what extent do we want biological humans to be controlling the long-term future, or to what extent should we be trying to achieve something that's sort of more globally good? And I think, intuitively speaking, we'd like to balance these in a sense where we can like try and get the best of both. We want our civilization to both be able to pursue values that are as far beyond us as the values of humans are to bacteria or to other single-celled organisms, but we also want there to be some sense in which they are the grown-up versions of ourselves, that they are continuous with our own civilization, that it's not just some totally alien creature. This is a hard ask. I don't have like a solid way to pin down how you should balance these two. But I think there's at least one important concept that is very underrated in, especially in modern Western society, and that's the concept of healthy asymmetric relationships. So what I mean by healthy asymmetric relationships? Well, I mean relationships between a stronger agent and a weaker agent A relationship where the stronger agent finds it meaningful and valuable to be benevolent to the weaker agent. One in which the weaker agent is confident that they're not being exploited by the stronger agent. And one in which it's difficult to turn them against each other. So the sort of canonical example of this we have is like parents raising children, right? That parents find raising children one of the most valuable things they can do in their lives. But you can also imagine it in many different contexts. For example, relationships between states, where some states are protected by others and have like these sort of client-state relationships, or even inside individual people's minds. I would call the relationship between the id and the ego, for example, an asymmetric relationship, where the ego is in some sense smarter than the emotions that tend to be triggered sort of randomly and blindly. But in some sense, in a healthy integrated mind, the ego is looking after the emotions, if you will. It's like sort of acting on their behalf rather than trying to suppress or repress them. So I think there are like, at many different scales, there's this theme that hierarchical or asymmetric relationships are interesting and valuable. I also think, though, that in general, Western culture is extremely egalitarian compared with the past. And so we don't think about this concept very much. So even in the cases of parenting, for example, we sort of think of the power that parents have over their children as a pretty temporary phenomenon, right? As soon as the kids grow up, they end up with a much more equal relationship compared with how it's been throughout almost any point in history. Similarly, when it comes to the relationships between different nation states, there are these huge gaps in the power between superpowers and much smaller states, but there's sort of this internationalist fiction that they're all on the same playing field, that, you know, they all have like one seat in the UN and they all like get to vote on how like geopolitics works, right? So I think there's this like very strong sense in modern society that almost this unspoken antipathy to asymmetric hierarchical relationships because of our very strong egalitarian spirit. I'll give actually one sort of extreme example here, which is that I think animal rights or animal welfare is a very important and valuable cause. I think it's really good to advocate for it, but I find it very odd that people tend to advocate for it by using language like anti-speciesist, right? You shouldn't be speciesist against animals. And so that's trying to co-opt the language of egalitarianism to talk about how we should treat animals better. But of course, you should discriminate against animals in almost every relevant way, right? You shouldn't hire them, like you shouldn't, I don't know, you definitely shouldn't date them, like you shouldn't, found a company with them, like whatever. Like in almost every way, like animals are extremely not on the same level as humans, right? And in fact, in some sense, the most powerful intuition for why we should treat animals well is precisely that they are beneath us, precisely that in some sense we are like much more capable entities and we have a sort of like noblesse oblige towards those animals, right? Like some sense that it would be like cruel and like mean-spirited to treat an inferior in the way that we treat factory farmed animals, right? But that's a sort of intuition that feels much more alien to us now than it used to. And so we see people talking about animal rights in these sort of implicitly egalitarian terms, even when it makes no sense. Okay, so my claim is that when we think about a good future, we would like it to be full of healthy asymmetric relationships because the space of possible minds is going to expand dramatically, and because if there aren't healthy asymmetric relationships, then only the minds that are like right at the peak of capabilities are going to, in some sense, be happy with the situation. And you're going to have this conflict between each generation that wants to give rise to their successes, but also wants to retain power for themselves. Like, in some sense, the same struggle we're facing today. Now, I don't know how to implement these healthy asymmetric relationships, but I'm going to finish the talk by just giving some sort of like general principles that seem pretty robust for like ways in which these have gone well or ways in which these have gone badly in the past. So let's start with, firstly, simply be honest about asymmetries, right? Like the precondition to have a good asymmetric relationship is that you're not pretending that you're equal. I think the modern social justice movement, for example, has tended to do this very badly because it is extremely egalitarian and so is like very loath to admit that some people are just like much more talented and virtuous and intelligent, for example, than others. And so there is some kind of inherently asymmetric relationship there, right? And if you acknowledge that relationship, then maybe you can start to build social structures that are premised on a kind of altruism there. But it's very difficult to acknowledge in modern culture. Whereas a very different case in which you can be very honest about the inherent asymmetry in this relationship is, pets, for example, or like in general, humans and their relationships to animals. Although even then, as I mentioned before, people are sort of trying to like creep away from that. So honesty about asymmetries, that's an important precondition. The sort of obvious thing to add here is just like, it is better when the relationship is based on a sense of like care or like love between the different parties. I think, obviously factory farming is a place where this has gone extremely badly, where humans in the sort of superior position have displayed very little care for animals. I also think, conversely, I think a lot of the most successful techniques in emotional integration and therapeutic techniques are premised on a sense of like love or compassion for the sort of dumber and less capable parts of your mind, right? So a lot of therapeutic techniques tend to involve being like accessing your inner child and like feeling care and love towards your inner child, or like accessing old emotional memories and trying to help heal them. So there's a sense in which I think individual humans are a showcase of the type of healthy asymmetric relationships that we might see at much larger scales in a flourishing post-AGI society. However, that's not sufficient. I think there are many ways in which, or many cases in which you can claim to be motivated by care for a weaker entity and then actually end up screwing them over. One example that is pretty salient is colonialism, where many colonial powers claimed to be motivated by compassion or like desire to help out sort of impoverished countries. And in some cases, the individuals involved were, but that doesn't help because it's very adversarially non-robust. That when you claim, when you're trying to help somebody, but you do so by taking away all their power, then it's very easy for other agents to start exploiting them. And so respect for boundaries between the more capable and the less capable agent is a way of ensuring that the more capable agent's altruism isn't weaponized against the less capable agent, that you can't sort of use your attempt to help them as cover for actually exploiting them. I think a case where this has gone better is like modern America and the Amish population, where there's this huge asymmetry between the sort of culturally, technologically savvy Americans and the Amish, but nevertheless the Amish have like actually managed to like hold on to a lot of their autonomy and like preserve their way of life, and in a way that's, I think, left them flourishing and like expanding dramatically as a population. Yeah, so I think there's something related to that respect for boundaries about the notion that if you're going to help a weaker agent, the way you should do so is you should try and empower them rather than just take care of them. I think modern welfare states, for example, are an example of prioritizing taking care of rather than empowering weaker agents. I think there's also something important to do with the idea of that weaker agents can, in fact, have some pressure over stronger agents, right, if they aggregate together. So by definition, if you have a weaker agent, like humans in the far future, we're going to have a much worse position than the stronger agents like AIs or transhumans and so on. But in aggregate, there may be ways to apply that pressure. I think a good example of this was like the success of nonviolent protests, especially ones like Gandhi's, which was where he was going against a much more powerful force. And so I think that's indicative of a case in which there is a like healthier relationship when that is possible than when it's not. I think the very last one I want to highlight is just that in the future, there's going to be nothing special about humans, right? Like if you're a transhuman or a much more powerful mind, like if you want something vaguely human-like to like instantiate your values, you can just create a new species, right? You don't have to be bound by the historical precedent that you care about humans or you care about like entities that used to exist, like animals. And so I think inherently, when I'm picturing this future that's a like, stable, good equilibrium, there's a component that humans and like other agents are valued simply because there is a historical relationship between them. I think Vatican City maybe is an interesting example here, where it has like very little hard power, but it has a lot of respect due to its like historical precedent. And so ultimately, when I'm picturing this good future, bringing it back again to the slide, I'm picturing a world in which there are these chains of historical linkage going out from right here at the bottom, that's humans as we currently exist today, towards much, much, much more capable or more powerful creatures that in some sense both care about weaker entities by virtue of gaining, finding value in being altruistic, and then also in some sense think of their own identities in terms of their relationship to those weaker agents. Just as parents think of their identity in terms of their relationship with their children, or I think of my identity in terms of my relationship with my past self. So I think that's still like a pretty abstract picture for how like we might think the long-term future could look, but I think that there's this important element here of this like gradually expanding tree of life that becomes far more diverse and far more capable while still remaining rooted in the historical legacy that gave rise to it. So that's my picture for a flourishing post-AGI equilibrium. If the AIs turned into social justice warriors, would that be worse for us than if they treated us like pets? I certainly think if they tried to pretend that we were as capable as them, or if they tried to pretend that there weren't strong cognitive differences between humans and AIs, I think that's the sort of situation that could go extremely badly, or like, yeah, fairly badly. I think in some sense, if the reality is that we are in the position of pets, then at the very first step is to kind of like acknowledge that at the very least. Yeah. Are there worlds in which AGI is not this like patriarchal guide figure? Like I had this fork in a previous slide between, in one set of worlds you have the future that's like morally good in an objective sense, in which case like humans are probably not even around anymore. And then another world in which the AIs are sort of like fully under the control of humans, or like humans like as we currently exist today get to exert a lot of a huge amount of influence over the future. So I guess those are two like types of scenarios that are like good in their own ways. Having said that, like I do think that both, yeah, for the reasons I laid out in the talk, both seem somewhat unsatisfying by comparison. How do we bootstrap love and care, or like are there historical traditions that we can draw from? I certainly think there are historical traditions we can draw from. I think in a previous version of the talk, I laid out the difference between like aristocracy, in which you sort of think of the in which the wishes of the more capable agents like the only things that you care about, and like a lot of the older traditions are more aristocratic, I think. So like in some sense I think we're kind of breaking relatively new ground and trying to integrate these like healthy hierarchical relationships with our modern sense of like egalitarianism and the idea that just because you're stronger doesn't give you like the right to do roughly whatever you want. Like that's obviously a very broad oversimplification, but I think there's a lot to draw on. But I think there's something new that we need to do here.